Welcome, everyone. I, Councilmember Walsh, call the February 24th, 2026 City Council Services, Safety, and Parks Committee to order. I am joined by Deputy Council President Martz, and we have an excused absence for our other member, Councilmember Nichols. The next item on the agenda is public comment, and I will just note that there is no one in the room, and I do not believe there is anyone online. So I will just note, if anybody does watch this later and wants to make comments, we always welcome them by emailing citycouncil@issaquah.gov. Next item of business, approval of the minutes. The minutes were distributed to the committee in advance. Are there any corrections?
No.
Okay, hearing none, the minutes are approved as presented. Okay, we have one item on our agenda tonight, and that is COM 0229, Hazard Mitigation Plan Update, presented by Jared Snyder, our Emergency Manager. We are going to have staff presentation, committee Q&A, any public comments if there is anyone at that point, and then committee deliberation and recommendation. So, Jared, we will let you take this one away.
Thank you, council members. I'm pulling up my presentation. All right. Does that look good? All right. Good, Cassie? Okay. All righty. Well, first of all, hello and good evening. Thank you for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to get the opportunity to talk about emergency management and the programs that we have here at the city, and really drill down deep into one of them today, being the Hazard Mitigation Plan Update. So the purpose that I'm before you today is to really talk about a few things. One is to review our draft annex to the Hazard Mitigation Plan, to get you all to provide feedback or direction on our hazard mitigation strategies, help us with prioritizing, that is, and then really recommending that the full City Council adopt the annex as part of the King County Regional Hazard Mitigation Plan, or not, of course. And then finally, at the end, we're going to have a little bit of time to have guidance and feedback provided on the broader emergency management program. As we heard via a council retreat, it was brought up and placed on the bike rack of ideas, if you will. So kind of an opportunity to talk about what we're planning on and some potential areas for growth in the future. So the direction needed is, one, recommend changes or adoption of Issaquah's Hazard Mitigation Plan Annex, and then give feedback on the broader emergency management program. So let's talk about the first item first. Recommend changes or adoption of our Hazard Mitigation Plan. To set the tone and really describe where this plan sits in emergency management in the city, as a reminder, we have three major lines of business, if you will, in emergency management. The first being emergency response, of course. That's really the bread and butter or the core function of what we do, making sure that we respond effectively as a city to emergencies and disasters alike. The second is community preparedness. That's making sure our residents are ready for disasters. And then third is risk reduction. And that's reducing our long-term vulnerability to hazards. And that's really the core of the plan that we're talking about today. It's almost like the work plan, if you will. So it's a very important part of what we do in emergency management here in the city. And so I'm happy, like I said, to take a deep dive into it and kind of explain where we would like to take our risk reduction efforts in the city. So first, let's start from the top. What is hazard mitigation planning? And one, it's federally required. So it's a federally required plan that's designed to reduce our risk through targeted investments in mitigation, essentially efforts that reduce our exposure to our many hazards that we have. So part of it is assessing those hazards, what our risks are and vulnerabilities, and then finally, developing okay, what are we going to do about it now that we have a good grasp of what our hazards are and our vulnerabilities? It also is an opportunity to engage with stakeholders, right, individuals and partners, that is, in conversations about resilience, about mitigation, about our hazards. So it's an opportunity there. And then really, like I mentioned, it's kind of our work plan for risk reduction through the next 5 years. It's a 5-year plan. So let's talk about where we've been with this planning process and where we are now. So we have participated in King County's base plan, and like I mentioned, this plan is an annex onto King County's plan. So it's a regional plan. All jurisdictions within King County have the opportunity to annex onto the plan, as well as special purpose districts, fire districts, and the like. Many have not. We are one that is choosing to annex onto the plan. Typically, the jurisdictions that do not annex onto the plan are the larger ones like Seattle and Bellevue. But for medium to smaller sized jurisdictions, it's truly the way to go, as King County cuts down a lot of the work needed to do this plan. So it makes sense. So I was actually part of the steering committee for that plan, and as such, we had good representation and ability to kind of get our feedback, if you will, into the plan. The next part of the planning process is we convened an internal team, internal of city departments, but also external in a sense, working with partners like Issaquah Fire and Rescue and other community organizations that we work with frequently in emergency management to document our hazards and understand our risks. The next step was using that same group where we started to strategize, okay, what are we going to do about those hazards and risks now that we feel like we understand them? After that, we drafted the plan, of which you have seen. King County and Washington State approved our plan. They gave us back feedback. We've since incorporated it, and that's also part of the document that you have. And then we're here on the flow chart. So each hazard mitigation plan needs to be approved by the authoritative body, for us being City Council. So once it is approved, hopefully, by City Council, then we can move for federal approval, where FEMA signs off on our plan and says that, yes, you have a true hazard mitigation plan. So also just backing up real quick too, I want to state, like, this is very important also too, not just to develop these strategies, but it also, I don't know if I mentioned this, but this makes us eligible for federal grants at many different grant rounds and levels. And so it's a mechanism that we do really need in place to really partake in those opportunities, those federal funding opportunities. So what you see here is the hazards that we plan for within the context of our annex. So we have two different categories, natural and human caused. So in natural, we have earthquake, severe weather. Severe weather is kind of a catch-all, if you will, for like snowstorms, bomb cyclones, things of that nature, events of that nature. Landslide, wildfire, flood, and volcano. And you might be thinking, is lava going to impact the city of Issaquah? No, it's not lava. It's more tephra, which is like ashfall from volcanoes, is what we're planning for. It can actually be quite damaging to things like flat roofs, to mechanical equipment, electrical equipment. There is a hazard associated with it. In terms of human-caused hazards, we're planning for hazardous material releases, health incidents, which are things like pandemics, terrorism, civil disturbance, a cyber incident, and then finally a dam failure. And dam failure might also come as a bit of a surprise, but some of our stormwater ponds are actually large enough that when they have full pools, they are considered to be dams by Washington State Department of Ecology, and if they fail, there could be downstream impacts to residents, businesses, and the community alike. So the next step of the planning process was to take a hard look at our hazards, determine their impacts on our community, and then where we were vulnerable. And so that group that I mentioned that was made up of many different city departments and partners, this is where things landed in our ranking of things. Wildfire and earthquake were the two hazards that we saw that we have the highest risk of having impacts really within Issaquah, followed by extreme weather, cyber incidents, health incidents, volcano, and then the rest you can see as kind of diminishing in there. So that's where staff ranked things.
Yeah, question, Councilmember Mertz?
Yeah, I have a question. So I'm used to traditional risk management being severity times likelihood.
Yes.
right? So can you explain, I don't understand exposure and susceptibility
Yeah.
as compared to, like I said, traditional likelihood.
Yeah, and so that's great that you brought that up. The risk equation changed a little at the federal level recently, and so the likelihood is wrapped up into vulnerability, susceptibility. Now it's just a rebranding, if you will, to some sense of it, but really what they're getting at too, right, is just like the likelihood of it, like what are the odds that this could happen here? So that's a great thing to flag.
Okay, and so these numbers you're showing here, 1.74, 1.9, 2.19, these are the risk numbers where you've multiplied severity times exposure times susceptibility?
That's right. Yeah. So what we did is we had every single staff member or partner who participated go through a scoring matrix, and then we added them all up, did these equations, and this is the results of that.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That seems like a good methodology. I did have actually one question. When in the section on wildfire, are you going to get more into details?
Yes.
I'll save it. I'll save my question.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll address kind of our approach to wildfire. We have a mitigation strategy that specifically addresses wildfire, and so we can cover
Okay,
more of it there.
I'll hold my question. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So a big part of hazard mitigation planning too is we also turn these plans out to the community, right, or engage with the community, and hopes to get some feedback on where they see their priorities being, right. So we brought this big poster board sized, really dot activity out to many different community engagements, asking individuals, or what are you most worried about as an Issaquah resident, right? What keeps you up at night? And it was actually it was kind of twofold, right? As you can see the collection of the data here, right? You see that earthquake, severe weather, and wildfire were really what the community was worried about, as well as cyber incident, which I thought was notable as fourth. But it was also served as an icebreaker, right, for our community to talk about this work more in depth, right? So it wasn't just put the dot up on the board, right, and then, all right, have a nice day, right? It really served as an opportunity to talk about not only like what we're trying to do with hazard mitigation, but emergency management in general. So the feedback that we received, I think, was really interesting and beneficial to our plan formation. I want to dive a little bit deeper into mitigation in itself. Like, why are mitigation projects actually something that we should be doing in Issaquah? And really, it's a good investment. So it's been well studied and documented by FEMA that every dollar invested in mitigation saves $6 in future disaster costs. And so that's a 600% return on investment, right? That's a pretty good number when it comes to money, right? And so to that effect, when we do have disasters, it protects our general fund, it preserves economic activity because we're able to, withstand disasters better. It reduces insurance costs not only for the city, but our residents through part of the community rating system, which is really speaking to flood insurance. So a lot of these actions that we take can actually lower our residents' flood insurance costs, which is a huge service. The next is it leverages federal funding, right? Like I mentioned, there's many grants available that we hope to take advantage of, and including following this big December storm that we had, the initial damage estimates for Washington State are $181 million of public infrastructure damage, right? So that's jurisdictional damage. And so what that means is following a presidentially declared disaster, typically 15% of that is made available back to the impacted jurisdictions in the form of grants. In this case, that's $27 million in grants. And so, that's a huge opportunity, right, of federal funding that we would like to take advantage of here in Issaquah. And so that's just one example of a grant round. The next is it protects vulnerable residents, right? We can invest in projects that specifically protect our most vulnerable. It shortens recovery time. Our recovery time is so essential for getting life back to normal, businesses, right, continuing business and the like, and really it future-proofs our infrastructure too, right? So it's an investment in the future, right? Making sure that whenever one of these events happen, we're prepared for it, and that we don't have to go back and rebuild to the same extent we would otherwise. So I wanted to highlight just a few examples in Issaquah of mitigation in the past. And so here's an example of some flood buyouts here. What you see in the red circle is 2 homes. In the next slide, you'll see that those homes we actually bought out and have since turned into green space. That happens to be where we put our sandbag, or one of our sandbag filling stations currently, right, to make available to residents on the East Fork that typically flood out. That's one example. 2 more here is a solar and storage project at Issaquah Center. So recently we received funding through Washington State Department of Commerce to put not only solar panels, but also a battery system that will last for quite a while to power that building following power loss, which is great not only for the building itself and our carbon reduction goals, but it also keeps a generator, a portable generator, in our suite of assets that we can use to, put either different resilience hubs or pump stations or the like, right? So there's also trickle-down impacts from money that we spend in these mitigation projects. The last example I wanted to highlight was Confluence Park, and this is a drone footage shot from the December flooding that we had. And you can kind of see how there is this flood spilling into Confluence Park. You can't quite tell from this individual picture, but there's homes right if you look at the top of the picture there, right, that are not flooded out. But the park there is behaving exactly how we like it, right? It's becoming, it has this mitigation impact in our community, and relatively low impacts to the park itself, but big impacts for the community members that could have potentially been flooded out by this event. So those are just a few local examples of some mitigation successes that we've had, and I hope that kind of serves as a catalyst, for dreaming, if you will, about what we could do in the city when it comes to risk reduction. So with that, these are the hazard mitigation strategies that our planning group came up with. And I should note that FEMA requires that we have a hazard mitigation strategy for each of our hazards identified within our plan. So there are some that are smaller in nature, right, to kind of tackle, or very niche, if you will, to tackle some of these more corner cases for hazards. Some of them are larger. And I should also say too, right, at this point, most of these mitigation strategies they're aspirational in a sense, right, where we're not, we can't commit ourselves to doing all of them right now with our existing level of funding, right, but these are the things that we as a group, as a planning group, have come up with as potential solutions to our risks for these hazards. So spending a little bit of time on them, because I would love to hear your feedback on what you see as potential priorities for us to maybe put at the top of the list, if you will, for our staff to start working on, or to potentially fund in future budget discussions. I just wanted to provide a brief overview of all of them. So the first and foremost is critical infrastructure seismic retrofits. So this is taking a look at our critical infrastructure, evaluating it under our modern understanding of our seismic threat, and then really determining what the best course of action is thereafter, right? So some infrastructure will be fine. Some may need a retrofit to actually remain functional following a maximum credible earthquake. The next is special flood hazard area risk reduction. So this is a complementary mitigation strategy to other plans that we have in the city and a lot of the works that Public Works does to reduce our flood risk. But really what it's looking at is elevating, acquiring, and mitigating repetitive loss properties, but also upgrading our infrastructure for flooding. I should also mention too, if at any point, if you want to drill down deeper into any of these, I'm definitely happy to take a break and stop. So Councilmember Martz, this is the wildfire risk reduction implementation strategy. So this strategy, it speaks specifically to really adapting our west of the Cascades communities and finding mitigation strategies that work for our community, right? As I've come before and talked to council about before, there's a big difference between east of the Cascades and west of the Cascades fire regimes. And so making sure that our strategies that we do are tailored to us here in Issaquah, but it's also implementing our wildfire evacuation time estimate study results. So these chiefly, the main things called out in the mitigation strategy are our evacuation routes. So doing formal studies on the viability of the engineering behind them, making sure that the roads up in Forest Rim and the Highlands are studied, and we can see take the next step of implementation in those. And of course, based on what we find, right, then that's when we can work them into a potential capital improvement project or the like. And so this is our big wildfire project. Councilmember
Question?
Martins. Yeah.
Great. What's the timeline?
Yeah, so this plan, right, is this is, if you will, the work plan, right, of our risk reduction efforts. And so I'm hearing that this is a priority in some communication that you've also sent to me. So, this is, if this is the direction that council has, we can put this at the top of the list. Now, of course, we don't have currently funding, right, like set aside for doing those formal studies, but yeah.
To be clear,
yes.
wildfire and I think earthquake are the two highest in your risk
Absolutely.
management. So it's not like Councilmember Martz is asking you to go down a rabbit hole on some pet project of his, right? This is one of the two areas that your own analysis said we need to be the most proactive regarding.
Absolutely, yes. Sorry, I apologize if I implied that.
I just want it to be clear for anybody
Yes.
who might be listening that it ties back to the slide we talked to a little bit ago, where civil insurrection and volcanic hazards are nothing compared to earthquake and wildfire hazards. Those are just
That's right.
a whole different level, both of impact should they happen and likelihood of occurring.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And and the staff agrees, yes, to your point with that assessment. And so
what I'm hearing you say is that although you said it was FEMA requires that we have plans, I guess it doesn't require that we execute those plans?
no. And so yeah, which is
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it is, right? It's an interesting honestly, I think it shows that these plans, right, in themselves, like I said, are a little more aspirational. But I should say the staff is quite committed to mitigating, and these efforts, I would say, with that federal big grant funding round that's going to be made available, right? These are the types of opportunities that outside of our existing budget, right? Those are the things that we can try to take advantage of to push the timelines on our regular funding mechanisms to make these things happen faster. And so that's absolutely a priority, right? Wildfire was our number 2 in that risk assessment. So that's the type of project that we would like to prioritize moving forward. Now, the timeline, of course, I didn't answer your question about the timeline only because, we don't have a solid one yet for when we would get those more formal studies done. But working towards that is what I'm hearing, and it is one of our priorities.
So if earthquake and wildfire are the two most serious ones, is there a point where, and you're saying that we're not going to delve into what we've outlined for FEMA until the council funds that activity?
Yeah.
Is there a point where we get an a la carte list where it says we need $437 for this and we need $827 for that?
Yeah, so what our plan is to incorporate these mitigation projects into the next CIP budget round. And so which is actually something where it legitimizes this plan, right? To your point, Councilmember Martz, of making it less aspirational and more concrete, right? And then it'll be in the regular funding process, right? And so if we're serious about these things, we can actually take those normal steps and not have to explore these roundabout methods, right, of funding and the like. So, yes.
Jared, so on some of these, particularly on the 2 top priorities, can you talk a little bit more about the individual, implementation plans? So, for the wildfire risk reduction on page 45 of the annex, it talks about 2-year objectives, 5-year objectives, and long-term objectives. I assume that came from staff. Does it connect anything into our existing budget or CIP, or is that just kind of the next step that you envision there?
That is the next step. So I'm really hoping that this plan, right, doesn't become shelf art is a term that we sometimes use with plans, right? I really want to operationalize it and make it a normal part of the potential options that we have to fund. So yeah, those 2-year and 5-year plans and long-term objectives, right, or those goals rather. That's part of the standard that King County puts out as like a mitigation annex. So we have to follow those. But this sounds like a good opportunity to just talk about like how we plan to go about keeping track of our progress towards these mitigation strategies. And what it looks like is there's a point of contact assigned to each of the strategies, right? And I'll have yearly check-ins with those point of contacts to see progress, and many of them happen to be projects where I am the lead for as well too. And so we'll have a internal tracking sheet of our progress towards those objectives, and we're happy to share back our progress, right, as we march towards those goals through the life of the plan. So, yeah. Great. So I'll continue to talk about the mitigation strategies or highlight a few more of them. But the next up is Issaquah Police Department Civil Disorder Training. So this is to really establish standardized and recurring training for our police officers to make sure that they feel confident in responding to civil disturbances. Next is Resilience Hub implementation. So as you may know, we have Resilience Hubs scattered throughout the city. We're working on expanding them further. They're meant to be locations where people can go to in any disaster, hoping that the lights are on, a place where people can receive some base level of support, right? And so we are hoping to expand that network and make those locations even more resilient to disasters, right? So that strategy really speaks to the work that we are partnering with sustainability on to make sure that they are available and that they can be these like these cornerstones of resilience in our neighborhoods, if you will. A community GIS hazard viewer is speaking to the need to really get this information out into the community, right? You'll see in the plan that we have these maps of these hazard areas, right? But that's not a very user-friendly way of going about finding information and the potential impacts to the community. So we'd like to create a hazard viewer where residents and businesses and even city folks too, right, can have this one place where we can see hazards and better understand our risks and incorporate them into our planning. The next is city building seismic analysis and retrofit. So we talked about critical infrastructure. This is the city building side of things. And so I should mention that this is one strategy that we carried over from the last plan. We've done some work on it already. We've received funding through 2 grants to do seismic assessments on some of our buildings, being City Hall, the Public Works campus, and then the next round that's coming up is really parks buildings. So community center, senior center, Pickering Barn, and the ops building that facility shares. And so we've found, over the course of those studies, right, about some of the upgrades we need to make to City Hall. And so once we get through the rest of these assessments, that'll help us prioritize actually, or justify rather, going after these bigger, larger seismic retrofit projects and really taking those studies to the next level, if you will. City critical infrastructure energy resilience. So this is also a carryover from our last plan. And really this just speaks to the need to have resilient power systems at our critical facilities, being buildings and infrastructure, to make sure that they remain operational, right? I brought up the senior center with the solar and battery storage, right? But our goal is to really have these key elements of our infrastructure hardened. I mean, the bomb cyclone was so revelatory, right? And just how strained we can get, right, when we're faced with these long power outages. The next is post-wildfire development and high-risk debris flow zones. So this is about updating our land use and development regulations to really take a hard look at what do we do with an area after a wildfire has burned through it, or conversely, what happens if a wildfire burns upstream, if you will, from a development? And the reason we think about that is you may have seen or heard some communities in California dealing with mud flows, right, post-wildfire. And so even if a community isn't necessarily impacted by the flames, they can be impacted by landslides or landslide-like situations following a wildfire. So taking a good hard look at that and making sure that we have a plan when it comes to those debris flow zones. The next is a carryover too. So this addresses SAISH and tsunami modeling in Lake Sammamish. And so if you're unfamiliar with a SAISH, it's essentially like a bathtub effect of like water moving back and forth. And so this is a strategy to take a harder look at that. It's kind of nested. It's part of earthquake as well too. That's the main instigator, if you will, for SAISHs. And so we actually historically have engaged UW trying to study this as a potential project. There was some initial interest, but we're still going to attempt to study that, but it's a little bit in lurch. Enhancing air quality and chemical detection near vulnerable populations. This is our hazardous materials release mitigation strategy. So deploying detection capabilities near high-risk corridors and vulnerable populations to enable faster response to hazardous air releases. We have transportation corridors, a major one, I-90, that runs through our community. There is a lot of hazardous materials that cross through Issaquah every day. Not to mention we have pipelines and facilities that also house a considerable size of hazardous materials just on the day-to-day.
Deputy Council President Mertz.
So as you're discussing all these things, these are all things that you could do if we wanted to fund them.
Correct.
Right? So these are all, you're showing us the menu. And you're saying, if you want the sea bass, here's how we would prepare the sea bass.
Yes.
If you want the lobster, here's how we would prepare the lobster. None of this is necessarily things that you are going to do otherwise.
Correct, yeah.
And so how do we decide? They all have price tags associated with them. And as you've mentioned earlier, some of them have higher probability times severity and others have lower probability times severity. There was a point in this city where one of your predecessors thought a sea wave was a serious risk because we have the ground fault that runs into the city, which is capable of producing sea waves. Clearly, in the score that has been given in this, sea waves are not considered near the top of our risk setup. So how does this work? Like, it seems like at some point we have to get the menu. At some point, the waiter asks us what we want to order, right? And we say, I want the sea bass, and I want the lobster, and I want the Caesar salad, but only if it comes with the anchovies, right?
Yeah.
And so when and how do we do that?
Yeah, I love that analogy. Thank you for that. That really, I wish I had said that. Thank you. But that is, so I would say this is maybe your opportunity to hear a little bit more about the menu items, if you will, under this analogy, right? But also, I would say the budget is a big opportunity to order, right? But two, if directed, like I'm hearing some priorities already emerge, right? We have some capacity to chase some of these mitigation strategies with things like grant funding, right? And so I am constantly on the lookout for grant funds and apply frequently for them, right? I think we've done three grant applications for a new generator at City Hall, right? We've mentioned some of the other senior center improvements, these seismic studies, right? So even outside of funding, right, if you order, right, wildfire risk reduction, I'm going to listen to that. I'm going to hear that, right, and say, okay, when I'm seeing these grant opportunities, that's the project I'm going to put forward. In theory, we could put all these forward in grant rounds, right? We could submit every project that we have in a hazard mitigation plan. We don't have capacity for that, in emergency management, right? With our current staffing and just resources, but that's an option, right? We can develop whatever one of these we would like to try to get, right? And order that, if you will. So I should say too, priorities can change as well, right? So this plan is considered a living document, right? So if there is new mitigation strategies, new efforts, new critical vulnerabilities that make themselves aware to us, we can change and shift our priorities in that. So this is one opportunity, but really, there's many too. Also, I welcome any feedback or any direction, really, at the course of the life of this plan. So
Jared, to build on the lovely analogy, it sounds like this annex says we are required to put together a menu of all of the potential hazards and how we would mitigate them. But it will be up to City Council, if we adopt this, and then at a later date, to encourage its inclusion in the CIP, to budget for spending on those items, and to provide our feedback on what are the most important ones for going after things like grants that will help put those items on our plate.
Yes. Love that.
Continue. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should say too, right? This is kind of a jumping off point, if you will, too, for these projects, right? Like, for example, if we do get a grant or do get funding for one of these projects, part of our regular internal process is to come forward, right, to council to talk about that project, and so this isn't like to your point, Councilmember Martz, right? If you want the anchovies, right, there will be other opportunities to provide feedback and more direction on each of these individual projects, just through our regular mechanisms that we have within the city. All right. So the next one is upgrading HVAC and air filtration and resilience hubs. And this is about really improving indoor air quality. So MERV 13 air filtration is really the level that you want to filter wildfire smoke that makes air clean, if you will, that vulnerable populations or even just regular individuals can feel comfortable breathing that air. Today, right now, we actually don't have a facility that has that level of air filtration. We're working towards that, hopefully, on the community center, but really, expanding that level of options for our community members, right, is something that we would like to do, specifically at our resilience hubs being community-facing locations. All right, last four. So create public-facing dam failure evacuation and warning materials. So as I mentioned, many of our community members may be surprised to hear that we have dams, if you will, within Issaquah that are a risk, right? And so it's a hazard that we just typically don't think about, talk about, or really socialize that broadly. And so this strategy really speaks to making sure that we have evacuation maps, that residents know that they live in these dam inundation zones, and then provide some guidance on what they can do to better prepare themselves. Next is developing and exercising a cyber incident response annex. So this is creating and regularly testing a response plan to protect our critical infrastructure and systems and maintain just government continuity during these attacks. I should say this is really just a piece of our cyber incident response catalog, right? There's much more work that goes into this than just this one strategy, but that's something that we picked out as a potential area that we could strengthen in coordination with our regular cyber incident plans.
Yeah, I was just going to ask on that. Councilmember Nichols had questions about, that sounds like a plan to respond, but we also have other things that we do that are preventatory and training and things like that, obviously, so.
Yes, yeah, and if Councilmember Nichols or Council would like more information about, just how we are prepared for cyber attacks, we're happy to share more information.
Thank you.
Great. Next is planning for prolonged regional transportation and supply chain disruptions. So this is a plan that really speaks to our need to be self-sufficient following a major disruption of transportation corridors. It seems somewhat far-fetched sometimes, but I mean, you take the December flooding, and it was quite interesting to see, right? We lost eastbound 90, SR 900, and then Issaquah Hobart, right? All had disruptions on them. And so it was quite revelatory in one moment in the EOC in the Emergency Operations Center, where we're like, wow, our only option is to go west, from the city. And so this strategy speaks to just making sure that we're prepared, that we have a good list of capabilities, local, know our local vendors and contractors, have good relationships with them, and implement some agreements, hopefully even with them. And then lastly, training for city staff on suspicious activity reporting, right? So this is speaking to our terrorism hazard, but providing city staff with training to recognize and appropriately report suspicious activity to enhance that early threat detection and prevention. So those are our mitigation strategies as they exist now. As I mentioned, this is a living document. New mitigation strategies may be added at any point in the lifetime of the mitigation plan. This, like I said, these are jumping off points, right? Like if we start to pursue these strategies more in depth, we can alter them, we can change them, and really make sure that they meet the needs of the city. So the options that we have today are, one, to adopt the annex, and so that maintains our grant eligibility for programs like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, Flood Mitigation Assistance, and Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funding, which is that post-disaster funding pool. It also helps align our mitigation plans with climate, infrastructure planning, and of course our budget, as we've mentioned. The second option is that we do not adopt the plan, and we lose our eligibility for those FEMA hazard mitigation dollars, but that certainly is an option as well. So our proposal and recommendation is that we do adopt our hazard mitigation plan, and that it goes to the full city council. So real briefly, timing and next steps. So we're here today at the committee review. We anticipate or are hopeful for full council adoption this March. After that full council adoption, we'll submit our plan to FEMA. They may provide feedback. They likely will not at this juncture. And then after plan approval, that gives us the eligibility to apply for those grants, to seek that funding. And then finally, once our plan is approved, we're going to further engage with the community and making sure that the plan is public, but also showcase and bring the community in these hazard mitigation efforts that we do choose to prioritize, and make sure that they stay involved in mitigation, and also just show off some of the work that we are doing in the city, right? And making sure that people see the work that we are doing to make us more resilient. So with that brings us back to the direction needed. So do you recommend any changes or adoption to our hazard mitigation plan as it stands? And I do have those questions from Councilmember Nichols too that we can address maybe at the end after your
Yeah, I've got those listed as
Okay.
well, so all of that. Deputy Council President Martz, do you want to start with any feedback on the hazard mitigation plan annex?
Well, if I understand it right, I think it all comes back to the slide that you showed with the risks, results from staff hazard and risk assessment. And I think that as a policy matter, can you go back to that slide?
Yes,
Just
absolutely.
so that we can refresh our memories on it. There we go. So really, the question is, how far down do you want to go on that list? If we were exceedingly wealthy and had people sitting around with nothing to do, you would do all of them, right? So I don't have any questions. We're sort of, are we at the point where we're just,
Yeah, either feedback or
Yeah,
you're
feedback,
good
okay.
with any adoption.
Yeah, my feedback is that we should get going on both the earthquake and the wildfire
Okay.
ones. I think those two are, extreme weather, we already, I think, have plans for those. Health incidents and cyber incidents are hard to predict, and we don't have, knock on wood, God forbid, a serious volcano risk right around here. So wildfire and earthquake are really just a whole different class, right? For folks who don't know, we have a surface fault that runs from Bainbridge Island underneath basically I-90 all the way into Issaquah. It's capable of producing greater than 1G earthquake events, and we absolutely need to have plans for things like that. Subduction fault events are a regional problem with regional solutions. And then wildfire, as we've discussed, we have quite a bit of risk associated with wildfires during the dry season when the fuel loads go up. So I personally would like to see us getting going on both of those. I'd like to see, if it requires subsequent funding by the council, do it. Bring it before the council, let the 7 decide, and then execute on it with timelines.
Awesome.
I think that both of these things are absolutely critical. I really appreciate you putting this together. This is the most comprehensive conversation about risks in the city that I've seen in 17 years. But now it's, and I'm speaking as one of 7, like, let's get going on these 2 risks that are just qualitatively different than all the other risks. But I'm interested to know what my fellow committee members think.
Yeah. So I've got my feedback. I also have Councilmember Nichols' feedback, so excuse me for going long, but I'm a community emergency response team member, so emergency management is kind of my thing. First of all, I think this is a fantastic report. I love to see not only that we have a good risk assessment and calculation, but that we also got community feedback and that we are looking at specific hazard mitigations and things that we can do in each of these areas. It's a lot more difficult to just look at it and say, prevent wildfire versus we recognize that there are specific hazards that we can mitigate in that area that will make us a safer community. So I like that approach of this report. I think from my perspective, I might want to think a little bit more about the impact and exposure of flooding in our community. While we only experience flooding in the valley floor areas as much, I think that doesn't take into account the idea that most of our community either uses resources or services or schools or other things in those areas. And so that is, it discounts the fact that those areas are used by the entire community, even if their personal property isn't impacted by it. And we've seen quite a bit of flooding that has had a full citywide impact, even if it only has exposure in those areas. So I might have personally calculated that a little bit differently that way. When we are thinking about investments and use of city funds, I really want to be careful to focus on projects that have a large-scale impact, and I think the Confluence Park flood storage is a really good example of that, rather than things that are necessarily related to individual properties, such as mitigation for repetitive loss flooding properties. That being said, if we combine it with then taking that and making the River Creek a safer place overall, I think that balances out. Similarly, I would be hesitant to invest city funds in things that were new planning areas like the Lake Sammamish SAISH and tsunami modeling, because we already have a lot of planning and understanding of many of these higher risk areas, and so that would be my preference there. The critical infrastructure seismic risk, I think that's a really great addition, and it seems to be an area where we can not only make investments, but also code changes about what needs to be made as a requirement for future infrastructure. And so that would be one that I would want to maybe follow 2 different paths on, one a budgetary, one a code and policy. When I'm thinking about the report, one of the things I had a hard time understanding was how we're handling all of our 2020 uncompleted items. Do those continue into our 2025 plan? How do they rank in priority compared to the list? How is that handled? So when we're looking about the report, I would say I want to see the 2025 mitigation strategies maybe earlier in the report, better explain what happens to the 2020 strategies. I would love to see the list of strategies ranked from high to low. Or alphabetical. Right now, I couldn't tell why something was in a certain order. And then on each individual mitigation page, I would really like to be able to see the priority, high, medium, or low, so that I didn't have to scroll all the way back up to that list to understand how it fits in. And then my final piece of feedback is on the topic of how do we make this actionable. So I'm glad to hear you've already mentioned the CIP. That was my first thought for the 2-year and 5-year objectives. On I'm wondering if there is an idea of having emergency management called out as a separate category, much like parks and transportation are, or if the idea would be to fit it into categories. I know we already have on our CIP, we recently did the capital improvement project plan. We already did something that gives us, what is it, the selection criteria. And so all of these projects would fit very well in the life and safety category. So I can understand how they're going to be scored, but I would be interested to be able to call out like, hey, emergency management is this area that isn't just about parks or transportation. It's really kind of its own category. Let me see if there was anything else in those notes. Yeah, and then toward that idea, could the hazard calculations be used, the risk calculations in our CIP data? Because I think that would be a really useful way of showing how important this project is. All of these are going to score very well from a life and safety aspect, but earthquake and wildfire should have some sense of more important than necessarily terrorism or landslide projects. So that's my feedback. I can go on to Councilmember Nichols, or if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'll address is kind of the old mitigation strategies, right? And so, truthfully, the previous iteration of this plan was mostly written from a public works perspective, and so many of the strategies were it was mostly incorporating work that Public Works was already doing, and using it as a leg to justify grant applications. That probably the one caveat to that is maybe the CERT strategy that's pulled from there. But again, emergency management used to be in Public Works, so in some extent too, I would say we are funding CERT already. Like we're well supporting that. I don't know what more we would call out in a specific strategy other than like all the other work that we're doing with CERT existingly. So I think, for the old strategies, some of them we did carry over, right? Like the energy resilience and some of these add-ons actually that we tacked onto the plan in like just the last couple of years, like the wildfire, the energy resilience, and some of those we did tack on. And so some of them got continued, but the older ones, I'm kind of personally okay letting them expire. And if there is maybe elements that we do want to pull out, right, like we can. But, Councilmember Walsh, I think it's a good point of like, we need to have some accounting of the work that we do, or almost like a record, if you will, right? Because I don't want to lose some of the wins that we have, right, when we just move to the next plan and not highlight some of the good work that we've done. So maybe there's a potential way that we could still incorporate them too in that sense. How does that sound? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let me go on to Councilmember Nichols. So he brought up some of the same things that Deputy Council President Martz did about, hey, there's no cost estimates. This isn't, a budget. And so he said it would be really useful to see at least rough cost tiers before this is brought before full council, or a commitment to deliver them shortly after adoption. And I think, I would be interested to know, how do you think that works with this plan versus accomplishing that through another method like the CIP?
Yeah, and so we talked internally about a potential approach. So we can incorporate cost estimates, if you will. You kind of using like a scale of like $1 sign through 3, right? To kind of at least give a sense of how much these projects might cost, right? And that tees up our ability, right, when we do go to like CIP, right? We can really hammer down and hone in on what those actual costs will be, but it still incorporates that, bird's eye view of what some of these costs are. And initially we actually we were thinking about cost estimates, but it got kind of tricky with some of the ones, like even the seismic assessments for critical infrastructure, right? Because it's like we may find that we're in pretty good shape for, a good amount of the water towers, or we may find that, oh my word, we need to have multi-million-dollar projects. And so I think staff were kind of struggling, honestly, with that that cost estimate part became a little bit of a stumbling block. But what we can commit to, though, is incorporating, I think, that range, if you will, or like that symbology a little bit, to just give us a sense of how much things will cost. And then when we do go to CIP or grant applications, of course, we'll like drill down into a real hard number. Does that sound sufficient?
Yeah, Deputy Council President?
I worry about timelines. When you start talking about CIP and grant applications, I worry that we're going to build a plan to build a plan to build a plan, and that when my term is up in 3.8 years, we still won't be done with these.
Right.
As an administration that has an emergency management person, both of these things are desperately needed. So, it would be weird to say, okay, well, here's the T-shirt size on these, right? Like wildfire is a medium and earthquake is a large, and that'll be some monies at some point in the future. CIP can take a very long time, and then the actual work itself takes time, and then any work that we decide to do as a result of those plans takes time. And again, I come back to my 3.8 years and wanting to have this resolved long before this current term is up. So that's my concern in this whole conversation is, the sense of urgency of getting going on something like this, on these two. I think you've correctly identified these two as really being a different level of risk than other emergency situations that we could possibly have. So how do we get it going? How do we get the scoping activity, the decision, and then the execution in a reasonable amount of time? And what is a reasonable amount of time, right? I don't think all this is leading you to saying, yep, and I'll have all this stuff done by the end of the year. Like, that's not what I'm hearing at all.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a challenge that we have, right? But like I said, this is, in some sense, a third of our work plan in emergency management, right? So this is what we're going to be working on, so that's my time, it's other staff members' time, it's not just me, right? There's other departments too, so.
I thought it is if we move forward with it.
Oh, yes, if we move forward with it, yes.
Assuming we move forward.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I will clarify, this kind of gets glommed all together in this presentation, but the first half is really about this hazard a mitigation plan. And then the second half is, and what else should we be doing with emergency management? Where should our focus be? And so I'm hearing very clearly, we have two very high priorities. And so I definitely want to drill down when we get into that on being like, okay, what's next?
Yeah.
Because it isn't just taking them into the CIP.
No.
Okay, let me just continue through Councilmember Nichols. He talked about performance measures. So each strategy includes metrics, but none have baselines, targets, or a reporting cadence. And he references that, hey, some of the 2020 stuff didn't get completed. So is there a sense with other plans, we have kind of created some of those metrics or targets. Is there a sense in here of what we want to accomplish, not just here's the hazard and here's a mitigation strategy?
Yeah, what I would say is that, these strategies truly are the jumping off point, right, for us as a city. So as we embark in these individual strategies more seriously, right, like all those kind of classic project management, tools, measures, they will be applied, to these efforts. This plan is mostly guiding, if you will, right, and a little less tactical is the way that my brain thinks of it. So, so those will be part of our strategies if we choose to move forward with them.
Okay. He also mentioned community engagement. He said 1,040 touch points is really impressive, but there was no sense of how many of those were Issaquah residents. And so he also mentioned he didn't see any evidence of outreach to renters, non-English speakers, or residents in map flood zones or the wild and urban interface, populations most affected by the hazards. So it'd be good to know if there was any targeted outreach.
Yeah, I thought those were really, really good points to bring up. And honestly, I think it's opportunities to grow in our community engagement. And what I would say too is that hopefully, this is not the end of our hazard mitigation, right? This is just the beginning, if you will. And so whichever, what our strategies when we start to implement them, we're going to look for that community feedback. We're going to look for that more targeted community engagement. And so I love that. I loved highlighting those points, and I think it's a really good thing that we can carry forward with us into the future.
Great. And then his last piece was just noticing that the CRS rating discrepancy on different pages. So
it was a good catch. Yes, we are a community 5 and working towards a CRS rating 5, working towards 4.
Okay, fantastic. So with that, I think generally I've heard both from Councilmember Nichols in his comments, but also between the two of us, general support for this annex plan, for the hazard mitigation plan. And so is there any other feedback you need from us?
Yes.
Sense of when it's going to come back to council and whether or not we want to put it on consent or regular business?
Well, I just want to foot stomp this again. I'm a movie guy. There's a scene in The Social Network where he says, if you had invented Facebook, you would have invented Facebook, right? We will have a wildfire and earthquake plan in place when we have a wildfire and earthquake plan in place, right? Mm-hmm. And so I want to have a wildfire and earthquake plan in place. To do that, we have to begin, right? Yeah. We have to accept the annex, and we have to say we want to see the T-shirting of the efforts. I want a wildfire and earthquake plan in place as soon as is reasonable.
Yeah.
So that's, whatever that looks like. I just worry that, again, we're building a plan to make a plan to have a plan. Right. And, this is super clear guidance why wildfire and earthquake plans need to be the core of our response. So I just wanted to foot stomp that idea.
Yeah. Foot stomp away, absolutely. Still need to approve the annex so that we can qualify for grants, and because we kind of just need to do it. And so are we good to adopt this? And do you have a sense of consent or regular business?
I'm absolutely excited about adopting this. In terms of it coming back on consent or regular, I guess I would ask the administration if they have a preference. I think that this report was clear enough that I would be comfortable as a junior member of this committee to tell the other 4 council members who weren't part of this process that the committee video makes it very clear why we want to move forward with this and not having it been regular. But if the administration comes back and said, no, we're super excited about having this on regular business.
Okay. So it sounds like we are in support of this coming to full council and comfortable with it being on consent unless the administration has any reason not to. We always like to highlight the great work of our emergency management team, but it sounds like we've got the rest of the presentation to talk about all of the other things that we want to foot stomp and deliver the plans that council is going to make demands on. So take it away.
That's a perfect tee up. So so the second part of the presentation is to give feedback on really our broader emergency management program, right? We've kind of heard that, from the mayor, but also from the council retreat, that emergency preparedness efforts, are a priority and something that we should think about. And so I just want to share with this committee a little bit about what's on the current work plan, some of the things we're thinking about, and then really opportunities that I see as growth areas to really bring our emergency management program to the next level, if you will. So a little bit of background. So things are changing in emergency management. One, disasters are happening more frequently, right? Right on this bar graph that you see here on the left side of your screen, right? You can see this increase in climate-driven hazards where there's been declared disasters in the last 5 years. And you'll see severe storm, flood, and fire are really the three captured there, but also all other declarations. And so those are typically the not climate-driven ones, but you'll notice that bar graph is growing. And, anecdotally, right, I will even say from my almost 3 years here, right, we've had some pretty serious incidents. And so that's just following the trend for the state. Two, the background context is FEMA is also changing very drastically. So there has been huge reductions to disaster response staff, to preparedness efforts, and really funding their system as a whole is changing. And so what the federal government is asking is that local jurisdictions shoulder more of emergency management, and what was typically FEMA's role, local jurisdictions are asked to take bigger parts of that. And so some of these things that we've enjoyed from FEMA being having leadership in emergency management are starting to wane. And so one of the most recent examples that hit home for us, right, is the bomb cyclone. That was a disaster that was large enough that would have qualified us for public assistance funding in previous understandings of what our thresholds were, but no longer, right? That bar has moved to be 6 times higher than what it was, just a couple years ago. And so all that to say is, the need for us to be prepared for emergencies, effective in our response, to pursue these risk reduction activities, I think it's higher, right, than what it was even a couple of years ago, just because the landscape has changed so drastically in a short period of time. So we've talked about risk reduction and in depth, right? But there's the 2 other pillars: emergency response and community preparedness, that we'll take a little bit of a deep dive into now. So here's what's really on the work plan this year, if you will, for emergency management. And so this is specifically talking about emergency response, which is protecting life, property, and the environment during and after emergencies, large and small. So we are updating our comprehensive emergency management plan this year. That is our foundational document that describes how we respond to disasters and emergencies within Issaquah. That is, it outlines duties, responsibilities, operations, really our guiding document for emergencies. So that's getting updated this year. This summer, we have some large events that are happening here regionally, so we're getting ready for them. They are chiefly the 250th anniversary of the U.S. and then also FIFA World Cup, right? So they happen to coincide at the same time, so 2 large events that, we want to make sure that our community and our visitors and everyone really just has a safe and good time at those events. Next is Resilience Hub expansion. As I've mentioned before, we're trying to get a Resilience Hub in every neighborhood within Issaquah, right? So that looks like working with community partners, organizations, and to really not only identify new locations, but strengthen them, make them more resilient, and support them so we can count on them when disaster does strike. And then lastly, I'm excited to come back before council and do some emergency management training and exercise with you all at some point, right? Kind of going over what your role is in emergency, some of the powers that you have, and really getting an opportunity to exercise those and have have some after action items taken from them. Next is community preparedness. So this is about informing and readying the community for disasters. So our chief way that we go about this is CERT, our Community Emergency Response Team, of which we have volunteers that go through a course that equips them with skills that can not only serve them, their families, but also their neighbors. And, it's in community preparedness, but we also use them in emergency response as well. CERT supported us in the bomb cyclone and in the flooding alike, doing everything from filling sandbags to handing out flyers and flood cleanup kits. So they truly do a lot for our community, of which our CERT program has grown immensely. We offer 5 courses now every year, as opposed to the 2 that we've traditionally offered. Our volunteer numbers are almost up to 400 for CERT, and so it's quite the cadre. And we have a lot of great people who are fired up and engaged with it, volunteers speaking, that really help drive that. So that's not all just the emergency manager, right? My hat's off to these community members who really have championed this effort. Next is wildfire preparedness, right? So we've done the wildfire evacuation time estimate. We still want to socialize those results more broadly, make sure people understand evacuation, can get prepared. Ready, Set, Go is a countywide program. It was actually used in the flooding too for evacuation levels. But we want to make sure people are ready for wildfires, so we're talking about doing more wildfire trivia nights like that we did last year, screening of more wildfire documentaries, and really updating also our online resources where people can learn about these things, including a GIS map that shows neighborhood by neighborhood what your evacuation routes are and what you should consider. So those are all efforts that are underway for community preparedness, specifically for wildfire. And then lastly, we want to invest in more just general trainings and engagements for the community, right? CERT is a big commitment for some individuals, right? But we want to make sure that we have smaller, more frequent touch points with the community that can help educate and make them aware of our many hazards. And so we're kind of revamping, if you will, some of those efforts, getting away from like the traditional just seminar style, but going to places where people already are, right? Like wildfire trivia is a good example of that, showing up where people already hang out and doing education kind of that way. So that's all part of community preparedness this year. And then, of course,
1 second
yes.
before we go on,
Yes,
Deputy
sorry.
Council President Martz.
So I want to make sure, I know wildfire preparedness, there's a lot in wildfire preparedness. I want to make sure that it's not like, hey, we have some pamphlets you can read about how to, cut brush away from the base of your house. Like I just want to walk you through a scenario, right? A house fire on the south side of Squaw Mountain during a high fuel load day leads to a wildfire that moves north, coming up over the top of Squaw Mountain, right? The city needs to have a plan. Obviously, EFR is, first line of response on something like that. But the city, IPD, Public Works, the city has to have a plan in place for an event like that, right? We don't have anything like that currently.
Right.
So that's what I think of when I think of wildfire preparedness. I mean, there is also the cutting brush away from the base of your home. But, part of our challenge is that Squaw Mountain is steep, and the things that you can do in Wenatchee to reduce the risk of a wildfire to your home, we just can't do here, right? So it's about evacuating people. It's about, critical minutes, during an event like that. So that's got to be part of our wildfire preparedness.
Yeah, and thank you for highlighting that. It'll actually be called out as a specific annex to our comprehensive emergency management plan too, is evacuation, to really hammer out those roles and responsibilities. We've one change that we've had from even the last wildfire season is we have a pre-wildfire checklist, if you will. So whenever we have those red flag days or critical fire weather, we actually get together department by department in a coordination call and bring up all the things to consider, right? Like, do we have keys for the right gates to open up these emergency access roads, right? Like, what's our plan for alert notification? So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. There's room to grow there, and I really expect the CMP, the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, we're gonna hammer out all those smaller details, but we're taking steps on that too. So, but thank you for highlighting that.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, in risk reduction, we just took a deep dive into this, so I'm just going to brush over this quickly, right? But of course, our hazard mitigation plan is nearing officially being completed. The seismic assessments I've mentioned on some of our city buildings, and then, of course, the infrastructure improvements at resilience hubs being the solar and storage, backup, and air filtration upgrades at the community center. Whoops. Okay, so with that, with each three categories, here are the three major ways that I could see us growing our emergency management program, right? So expanding our incident command system and emergency operations center training. This is really speaking to making sure that we have as many people in the city trained up on how to work in an EOC and emergency environment. And this really addresses that need that FEMA is pulling back, right, from this model where they're coming in, right, with a big team of 80 people to come support local jurisdictions, in a big disaster. That's not going to happen anymore, right? And so we need to make sure that from top to bottom, our staff feel confident working in that EOC and have a good handle and make sure that, we don't get overwhelmed by a large incident. And so that's,
Can I ask about the FEMA piece for a second?
Yeah.
Because my understanding is that one of the things that's occurring right now is FEMA is moving more to a block grant type situation, right? If you look at the total emergency fund expected distribution in 2026, it's a little bit less than it's less than 2025, but it's about the same as 2024. But my understanding is what really changes is that they're trying to move, again, towards a block grant type system, which would cause the states to have to look at their own, for instance, insurance policies and, instead of, I'm not going to carry water for the way the feds are doing things, but there is they're still spending, FEMA's still spending a lot of money, but that it's going to go out as block grants. Is that our understanding as well? And if so, should we be asking more of Olympia, right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I think if that is the way that they roll things out, I think that is a very good next step, is to make sure that that trickles down, if you will, to local jurisdictions. There's some fear, right, that Washington State Emergency Management Division has been really underfunded for a long time, and there's this sense that, or I should say, a little bit of concern in local jurisdictions that the state will mostly keep those funds, right, and that it won't really come down the way that the feds are envisioning. And so I think that is an advocacy opportunity. There is still so much that is up in the air when it comes to FEMA, right? They were supposed to, they have convened a council over the last year that was to make recommendations about how FEMA can change, right? That report was due in December, but it's gotten delayed to March of this year. So we're kind of holding our breath, waiting to see until March to see what actually comes to fruition with FEMA. But we do know, right, that staff reductions are happening at FEMA. That's for certain, right? But the actual future of what, those block grants look like, or how that money might be repurposed to local jurisdictions, I think is what we're all kind of holding our breath for. So, thank you for flagging that, Councilmember Martz. Yeah.
I just know that being glass half full, the idea here is, I'm going to pick on another state, right? Florida's needed insurance reform, hurricane insurance reform for decades, and they haven't had to do it because they've papered over the problem with FEMA money every time a hurricane comes through, right? So again, playing glass half full and giving the benefit of the doubt, the hope is that with this, the grant, going to block grants, it'll cause states then to have an incentive to fix their houses, so to speak, with insurance and whatnot. So it just seems like tracking that and seeing how that impacts our legislative agenda and making sure, there's very few cities that have the kind of both this earthquake and the wildfire risk.
Right.
There aren't many cities in Washington State that have our risk level.
Right.
So making sure that the state does the things that they need to do to put their house in order for when the time comes. It's a shame if we can't count on FEMA the way we used to count on FEMA, but if that means we need to count on the state and ask the state to step up more, then we need to count on the state and ask them to step up more.
That's a great option, I think, opportunity. So thanks for sharing that. So The next area for growth is really after action item follow-up from the flooding and from the bomb cyclone that we've recently had. We have a lot of items that we've learned that we could grow in, right? But we just admittedly don't always have all the time and all the staff capability to chase down and pull all those threads and make sure that we're fully implementing our lessons learned. So that's an area for growth. Really deepening EOC, or Emergency Operations Center, subject matter expert bench strength, right? So as mentioned, I'm a division of 1, right? And I'm the full-time nerd, for emergency management, right? And so while we have people who are highly capable of operating the EOC that are not me, right? Having another person too, right? That really has the time to invest, to really understand these systems, the intricacies, I think is something that would be a boon to the city, if you will. Expanding interjurisdictional mutual aid. So we can lean on other jurisdictions and their emergency management staff as well, too, as a way to make ourselves more resilient, right? We have neighbors, and as Councilmember Martz mentioned, Issaquah has we have a lot of risks, and sometimes a lot of things happen in Issaquah that are not happening in other jurisdictions, right? And so what we can do, with more resources is actually train up other jurisdiction staff on how to operate in our EOC within our structure. Other jurisdictions do it. Kirkland's a good example. They invite all kind of neighboring emergency managers once a year to come and learn exactly just it's all instant command system, but learn the nuances of their EOC, and that's something I see as an opportunity for us too. In terms of community preparedness, so CERT are some of our real community champions, if you will, of preparedness. So, but they're volunteers, and we want to make sure that they're engaged, and we want to make sure that they're passionate and continue to be those voices in our communities, really sharing about disasters and how to get more prepared. So we want to keep them engaged with monthly engagements. So that's bringing in PSC to do downed wire training. That's bringing in the speaker who's gone through a wildfire in Eastern Washington to share some of their highlights, right? So offering those things to our CERT members will only, I think, serve us to kind of strengthen that advocate that we have in the community. Neighborhood level education campaigns, right? Issaquah is interesting in the sense where each neighborhood has a very unique risk profile, if you will, right? So wildfire is a really big deal in the Highlands, Squawk, Talus, right? But flooding, it has a higher impact down here in the valley, right? So kind of tailoring that message, bringing that to a neighborhood level, right? I think would be a really good way that we could make our community preparedness efforts just a little bit more engaging, right, for residents and really bring it to home. Increased offerings of citywide trainings engagement. So I've mentioned this a little bit too, but just increase the frequency, right, that we have these trainings. In terms of risk reduction, so mitigation strategy implementation. You'll notice that there's a lot of mitigation strategies that are assigned to me in the mitigation plan, right? But as mentioned, it is me who mostly works on many of those, and so having more help implementing those, and then really grant writing, right? Grants, many of those applications are quite lengthy, technical, onerous, and sometimes you don't always get them, right? So there's not that return, but there's more grants out there than we have the resources to apply for, and so that's another potential area that future support could help us with, right? We could actually have someone helping write more grant applications for seismic infrastructure retrofits, right? For wildfire, evacuation route studies, things like that. Try to take advantage of those big pots of money, that are actually out there. So, those are some of the areas that I see, right, as potential areas for growth. But I would love to hear the committee's thoughts on just the emergency management program, some of the areas for growth, and really where we're going now. So.
Deputy Council President Smarts, do you want to do any more foot stomping?
I don't know about foot stomping, but because it's a topic we haven't been discussed yet this evening. But is part of emergency management hardening of our systems against disaster. I'm thinking here a little bit about water and earthquakes, but more specifically power systems, right? My understanding is we have 4 separate power systems in the city, and basically anytime anybody looks sideways at us, Squawk Mountain loses power, right? Because ours comes over the mountains from the east side. So have we looked at how, we have had over the last 20 years a number of multi-day situations where Squawk has lost power for 3, 4, 5, 6 days. Once you get to like 6 days plus, food storage is a big issue and whatnot. So I don't see hardening of utilities in this list.
Yeah, and that's where we have opportunity to partner with PSE on, being the main provider. And so I think our energy resilience strategy does call out working with them more and, really advocating and seeing if there's opportunities to collaborate, right? And some of those grants, the collaboration between private and public entities they help you, right? And so really engaging PSE and saying like, hey, if you are willing to, right, we can chase this money together. So that's certainly an area where we can look into more and partner with PSE.
Yeah, I think that would be important. I think there's been a long conversation about, in general, the quality, frankly, of the power in some parts of the city. But this whole system of having 4 completely separate, it's great if those 4 systems backstop each other, but they don't. Right. It's just you get the one that you get, and if it goes out, and it goes out more in Squawk than it does anyplace else, you're just out of luck for a while. So I think that would be an important addition to the plan.
Anything else? Otherwise, I've got a ton of notes. First off, I would say I really appreciate taking this moment to sit in what are we doing for emergency management? What are those 3 category areas of risk reduction, preparedness, and emergency response? And what does the council, and in this case, the Services, Safety, and Parks Committee, think are the important areas of feedback for you? So I would say my priority is emergency response. I think it's really important to recognize that nobody can do that except for the city. Nobody is going to be able to seismically retrofit our infrastructure so that all of the residents can be ensured that we can maintain ourselves in the midst of an emergency. The second is risk reduction. There's some things that individual property owners can do, but a lot of them, again, are city tasks, but sometimes they're going to require additional funding. And so that's why I would say emergency response is really the bread and butter, the thing that we need to do as well as possible. And then finally, community preparedness, because community members themselves can choose to do that work. So when I'm looking at those 3 categories, for emergency response, I'd like to get more information about our plans for Resilience Hub expansion. I saw that being really important in the bomb cyclone. I know there have been plans to do expansion into other neighborhoods. I'd like to get a sense of what the timeline is for that, what actions we're taking, what needs we might have in order to make that happen faster. Because from my perspective, that's a really important priority. I also agree with your idea that the Incident Command Center and the Emergency Operation Center, I probably have some of those letters wrong, training plus after-action follow-ups are really important. I'd like to get a sense if we have the budget and the staff to support that. If not, I think that is a really high priority for me to understand how we can do that emergency response better. Because as you said, you are one person, and I know you have a baby and you're gonna get sick. And so having a backup in that case, I feel is really important. So the cross-training, the after-action follow-ups, and the sense of do we have the staff needed there is important. For risk reduction, with the hazard mitigation plan, we talked a little bit about this as far as could this be a separate part of our CIP to bring awareness to the investments needed and the opportunities. But I'd also like to think about our investments there in the same way that we do the pavement management and the concrete management plan. In that, we have a sense of what are the needs and what investments do we need to do on an annual basis to maintain. So we not only have a sense of what our entire needs are, but also what's our target for each of the years. And that helps us then look at it and go, oh, we had a really rough year and we reduced some of our spending in emergency management, so we need to catch up there. Rather than just seeing these as necessarily individual projects. I think this gives us a better sense of what are the budgetary needs, are we investing at the correct level, and maybe are there different investment needs within certain disaster categories that would kind of give us a higher level sense of to be fully prepared for an earthquake. Here's all of our needs. Here's what we've done to be prepared for flooding, and some of that is going to be in the risk reduction section. Some of that is going to be in the emergency response, et cetera, et cetera. And so toward that idea, I think the focus on earthquakes and wildfires is really important. I will foot stomp here and say, I don't want to just see another plan for this. I think the hazard mitigation plan gives us some specific recommendations, and so I'd really like to see action on some of those so that we can say at the end of that 3.8 years that, look, we've moved the needle forward in these 4 areas, and this is why you're safer. Having a plan doesn't necessarily do that. Now, it's probably going to be important in the coordination of the Issaquah Police Department and Eastside Fire and Rescue and our Emergency Operations Center and things like that. But gosh darn, I want to say we have done things and made a difference on specific actions. So that would be my focus in that area. And then finally, I'd like to see emergency management be a bigger part of this committee's role. I think this can be a really great way for us to push this forward and make sure that it is a focus. Councilmember Nichols, when talking about the hazard mitigation plan, recommended that we get an annual report on hazard mitigation metrics and progress. And so I think that could be a great way to involve the committee and make sure that we are just continually beating the drum on how important this is for resident safety, for mitigation, so that we're not seeing expenses down the road, and for really making sure that we have the risk reduction there. So, feedback. Any thoughts, questions on that, or do you have what you need?
I think that sounds great, and I think that's a great vision, honestly, of how we can, not just make an emergency management, like shelf art and just pull it down when we have an emergency, right? But make it part of the regular business that we do in the city. And so I very much thank you for that feedback, and definitely heard. And I personally feel like I got really good direction from the committee tonight on where to go with emergency management. So thank you both.
Great. So I don't think there's any action here. I guess I will do a little side eye to Deputy Council President Martz in that this was something that council leadership asked us to discuss here so that it could then kind of filter through and we could figure out maybe in our planning and our agenda setting, what are some of the things that we should focus on. So I will hope that we can get the feedback from council leadership that all of this was useful and there is an action that this is going to take in the future once you guys have digested it all. I
don't think there's anything here that I don't think there's anything here that council leadership can go chew on to go do a particular thing. I think that we have made clear that the annex makes sense and that we are properly sensitized to wildfire and earthquake issues. And I think that the two of us have made super clear with Councilmember Nichols' concurrence that we want to see progress on all this. So respectfully, I don't think the ball's in the council's court. I think the ball is in the administration's court with this feedback to figure out how and when it wants to come back to tee up, whether there's going to be an ask directly of council from general fund, or whether you want to say we want to take 6 months and try to pursue grants, but I see it as a thing for the administration to come back based on the feedback we've provided today.
Yeah, maybe I'll just ask that if you'll keep an eye on the agenda as it gets set, and just, think about emergency management occasionally.
I do.
I know you do, and I'm giving you, the,
Yep.
yeah,
As the committee
fantastic.
chair, I will seek to perform that task as part of being a leader, part of the leadership team.
Fantastic. Excellent. Autumn, anything that you need from us on this other than the general feedback and sense of urgency?
No, the feedback tonight's been super helpful. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, we are supposed to also initiate public comment in a sense of this, but there is no one in the room and no one online?
We have had a virtual caller for a while, yes.
Okay, we have a virtual caller. So I will just note that we would welcome public comment. If you're on the phone, press *3. If you joined by computer or smartphone, look for the hand icon or send a chat to the host. And I will just wait a moment and see if we have anybody who wants to make comments virtually online. And are we seeing anything?
Not at this time, Chair.
Okay. Well, we always take comments by email, so you can always email citycouncil@issaquah.gov. And so that is all of the pieces there. Final piece of business announcements. Do my fellow committee members have any announcements to make? No? Okay, our next committee meeting date is April 28th, 2026. Our March 17th meeting has been canceled, and a Planning, Development, and Environment Committee meeting will be held that evening instead. And so there being no further business, the meeting is adjourned at 8:36 p.m. Thank you.